If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
Learning Spanish for Beginners podcast, session 16. Shortcuts to talk about the past in Spanish, part 3. Hi, welcome to a new session of Learning Spanish for Beginners podcast. In this session, we will learn a few shortcuts to talk about the past in Spanish. Por cierto, by the way, you can get a list with the 100 most common words in spoken Spanish at SpanishForAJob.com/top words. If you have ever felt overwhelmed with Spanish vocabulary, it's time to focus on the words that are used most often in everyday conversations. Remember, you can get your copy of the list with the 100 most common words in spoken Spanish at SpanishForAJob.com/top words. Shortcuts to talk about the past in Spanish, part 3. Using simplified conjugations to talk about the past. In Spanish, the conjugation of verbs in the present perfect is much simpler and predictable than the conjugations of verbs in preterite, and it can be used by beginners who want to learn how to express ideas about the past without having to learn several verb conjugations. Although preterite is often used in conversational Spanish to talk about things that happened before, the present perfect may also be used to express a similar idea. Additionally, it is easily understood by native speakers, and most importantly, it is much easier to learn because it follows highly predictable patterns that make things much easier for beginners. Because of this, using conjugations in present perfect to talk about the past is an easier way for beginners who want to speak conversational Spanish quickly. Let's see a few examples in both tenses to illustrate the difference. Pay attention to the endings and try to identify the patterns. First, an example in preterite using the verb hablar, which means to speak. Yo hablé con mi amigo ayer. I talked to my friend yesterday. Yo hablé con mi amigo ayer. Now, let's review an example in present perfect of the verb hablar, which means to speak. Yo he hablado con mi amigo ayer. I have talked to my friend yesterday. Yo he hablado con mi amigo ayer. Let's review another example of the preterite of comer, which means to eat. Ella comió una hamburguesa en la cafetería. She ate a burger in the cafeteria. Ella comió una hamburguesa en la cafetería. Now the present perfect of comer, which means to eat. Ella ha comido una hamburguesa en la cafetería. She has eaten a burger in the cafeteria. Ella ha comido una hamburguesa en la cafetería. Let's do one more. The preterite of dormir, which means to sleep. Tú dormiste en el hotel. You slept at the hotel. Tú dormiste en el hotel. Now, the present perfect of dormir, which means to sleep. Tú has dormido en el hotel. You have slept at the hotel. Tú has dormido en el hotel. As you may have noticed, the preterite does not seem to follow a predictable pattern, and the present perfect looks more consistent. Now, let's review the full conjugation of these 3 verbs. Once again, pay attention to the endings and try to identify the patterns. Let's begin with the preterite of hablar, which means to speak. Yo hablé, I spoke. Yo hablé. Tú hablaste, you spoke. Tú hablaste. Él habló, he spoke. Él habló. Nosotros hablamos, we spoke. Nosotros hablamos. Ustedes hablaron, you spoke. Ustedes hablaron. Ellos hablaron, they spoke. Ellos hablaron. Now, let's review the present perfect of hablar, which means to speak. Yo he hablado, I have spoken. Yo he hablado. Tú has hablado, you have spoken. Tú has hablado. Él ha hablado, he has spoken. Él ha hablado. Nosotros hemos hablado, we have spoken. Nosotros hemos hablado. Ustedes han hablado, you have spoken. Ustedes han hablado. Ellos han hablado, they have spoken. Ellos han hablado. Now let's review the preterite of comer, which means to eat. Yo comí, I ate. Yo comí. Tú comiste, you ate. Tú comiste. Él comió, he ate. Él comió. Nosotros comimos. We ate. Nosotros comimos. Ustedes comieron. You ate. Ustedes comieron. Ellos comieron. They ate. Ellos comieron. Now the present perfect of comer, which means to eat. Yo he comido. I have eaten. Yo he comido. Tú has comido. You have eaten. Tú has comido. Él ha comido. He has eaten. Él ha comido. Nosotros hemos comido. We have eaten. Nosotros hemos comido. Ustedes han comido. You have eaten. Ustedes han comido. Ellos han comido. They have eaten. Ellos han comido. Finally, let's review the preterite of dormir, which means to sleep. Yo dormí. I slept. Yo dormí. Tú dormiste. You slept. Tú dormiste. Él durmió. He slept. Él durmió. Nosotros dormimos. We slept. Nosotros dormimos. Ustedes durmieron. You slept. Ustedes durmieron. Ellos durmieron. They slept. Ellos durmieron. And now let's review the present perfect of dormir, which means to sleep. Yo he dormido. I have slept. Yo he dormido. Tú has dormido. You have slept. Tú has dormido. Él ha dormido. He has slept. Él ha dormido. Nosotros hemos dormido. We have slept. Nosotros hemos dormido. Ustedes han dormido. You have slept. Ustedes han dormido. Ellos han dormido. They have slept. Ellos han dormido. As you may have noticed, the preterite tense does not follow a highly predictable structure when compared to the present perfect in this small sample of 3 verbs. Although there is a logic behind the preterite conjugations, using the present perfect to talk about things that happened in the past is a much simpler and easier way for beginners to get started. Let's take a moment to examine the present perfect in more detail. If we look at the 50 verbs most commonly used in conversational Spanish, we will see that approximately 9 out of 10 will follow 2 simple conjugation rules. For verbs whose infinitive ends in AR, just remove the AR ending and replace it with ADO. And for verbs whose infinitive ends in ER and IR, remove the ER and IR endings and replace them with IDO. Out of the 50 verbs most commonly used in conversational Spanish, only 5 have unstructured conjugations that must be memorized. Here are those verbs. Visto, which means to see, it comes from the verb ver. Muerto, which means morir, to die. Supuesto, suponer, to suppose. Hecho, hacer, to do. Dicho, decir, to say. In other words, by using the present perfect to talk about the past, 90% of the 50 verbs most commonly used in everyday Spanish have highly predictable conjugations that are easy to learn, and there are only 5 verbs that need to be memorized. On the other hand, if we review the preterite conjugation for the 50 verbs most commonly used in conversational Spanish, most beginners will feel discouraged with the amount of work and energy memorizing them would require. Because of this, and because our goal is to learn basic conversational Spanish quickly while making things simple and avoiding unnecessary complex structures that usually delay and discourage most beginners, we will focus on using the present perfect to talk about things that happened in the past from now on. Now let's review the present perfect structure. Using the present perfect is relatively easy. You only need to learn the present tense conjugation of the auxiliary verb haber, which means to have, and the endings for the verbs in past participle. They are easy, so don't worry about it. In other words, this is the formula. Present perfect equals personal pronoun plus haber conjugated in present tense plus verb in the past participle. An example is this. Yo he comido. I have eaten. In Spanish, you can form the present perfect conjugation of most verbs by dropping the AR, ER, and IR ending from the infinitive form and adding the following endings. Most verbs whose infinitive form ends in AR have the ADO or ADO ending in the present perfect. Most verbs whose infinitive form ends in ER and IR have the IDO or IDO ending in present perfect. And there are a few exceptions that end in TO and CHO, which are not that common. The auxiliary verb haber. Now let's take a moment to review the present tense conjugation of the auxiliary verb haber, which means to have, before moving on. Here we go. Yo he. I have. Yo he. Tú has. You have. Tú has. Él ha. He has. Él ha. Nosotros hemos. We have. Nosotros hemos. Ustedes han. you have. Ustedes han. Ellos han. They have. Ellos han. Now let's look at a few examples of past participle conjugations. Let's begin by looking at the past participle conjugation of 5 important verbs in Spanish. The past participle of ser, which means to be, is sido. The past participle of estar, which also means to be, is estado. The past participle of ir, which means to go, is ido. Past participle of saber, which means to know, is sabido. And the past participle of poder, which means to be able to, is podido. Now, let's look at 7 examples that use the present perfect to talk about the past. Yo he sido. I have been. Yo he sido. Tú has ido. You have gone. Tú has ido. Él ha estado. He has been. Él ha estado. Ella ha hablado. She has talked. Ella ha hablado. Nosotros hemos sabido. We have known. Nosotros hemos sabido. Ustedes han podido. You have been able to. Ustedes han podido. Ellos han comido. They have eaten. Ellos han comido. In summary, in order to use the present perfect tense to talk about the past, you need to know the following things. First, the present tense conjugation of the auxiliary verb haber. And second, the past participle conjugation of the verb you want to use. If you would like to learn how to talk about the past easily without having to memorize lots of conjugations, you can visit SpanishForYourJob.com/past, where you will find a complete guide to talk about the past in Spanish without having to struggle with the preterite conjugations. To access the complete guide with shortcuts to talk about the past easily, you can visit SpanishForYourJob.com/past. That's all for now. If you would like to review a text version of these contents, you can access a PDF transcript of this lesson at learningspanishforbeginners.com/16. Thanks for listening to Learning Spanish for Beginners podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, please leave a review and let me know what is your biggest challenge when it comes to learning Spanish so I can help you. See you next time. Hasta la próxima.
Weddings are the celebration of all the details that make a couple perfect for each other. And you can find your perfect fit too at Indochino. Choose every detail of a custom tailored suit, from lapels to linings and more, starting at just $4.99. My bad. Shh. Sorry. Find the suit that's perfect for you. Go to Indochino.com and use code PODCAST for 10% off any purchase of $3.99 or more. That's 10% off $3.99 or more at INDOCHINO.com. Code PODCAST.